The difference between both heroin and cocaine and fentanyl is huge. Fentanyl is synthetic and potentially an endless supply of it because it's synthetic. It's all chemicals. And those chemicals are coming from China, going into Mexico, which is right our border to the south, our biggest trading partner, and then coming across the border. So that presents very significant challenges that are actually different from the challenges we faced with heroin and cocaine.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production.
I'm Charles Fain Lehman, a fellow here at the Manhattan Institute. Today, we're talking about drugs and the drug crisis, particularly as it has affected New York City. In 2022, the most recent year for which numbers are available, over 3,000 New York City residents died from drug overdose. That's the highest figure on record, at 12% against 2021, and over 300% in a decade. Those deaths are driven by the spread of potent synthetic opioids. 81% of deaths involve fentanyl, for example. My guest today has spent nearly 3 decades as one of the city's chief drug enforcement officials. Bridget Brennan has served since 1998 as the Special Narcotics Prosecutor for the City of New York. In that capacity, she oversees an office of 200 people prosecuting felony drug offenses across the 5 boroughs. Prior to her service as the Special Narcotics Prosecutor, Ms. Brennan was Assistant District Attorney in the Manhattan DA's office and Chief Assistant in the Special Narcotics Prosecutor's office. Bridget, thanks so much for joining us on Manhattan Insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, before we get into the details of the crisis, I feel like I should give our listeners, especially our New York City listeners, a little bit of context. Listeners may not be aware, to get really New York 101, the city is divided into 5 boroughs, and those contiguous with 5 counties. And each of those boroughs has a district attorney who is responsible for prosecuting crimes in those boroughs. And then there is a 6th prosecutor who is responsible for specific crimes across all 5 boroughs, the Special Narcotics Prosecutor. So tell us, what is the Special Narcotics Prosecutor? Where does it come from? Why does it exist as a unique and distinct prosecutor in the 5 boroughs?
Well, Charles, the office has a very interesting history. It was set up during the heroin crisis, which was more than 50 years ago. And the reason it was established was to address an epidemic that was sweeping across the city then. The problem, as the legislature saw it, was that there was no coordination on the prosecution of felony narcotics offenses. They felt very strongly that they were being given short shrift. The cases weren't being prosecuted seriously enough by the 5 elected DAs. And they thought that was part of the problem. It was back in the Rockefeller era, where one of the results of Rockefeller drug law reform. But the concept was that the Special Narcotics Prosecutor would have jurisdiction over all 5 counties because each county can only prosecute crimes that happen within each of their own boundaries. And so the Special Narcotics Prosecutor would track the source of the drugs, and the drugs naturally flow from one county to the other and create a coordinated policy for addressing felony narcotics offenses. Originally, the concept was we would handle all of this city's felony narcotics offenses. It never quite happened that way. The office was established in Manhattan. That's where it always has been, and it still is. And the 5 DAs were supposed to, and do to this day, provide assistant district attorneys to our office and coordinate policy. But the Manhattan DA always supplied more assistance than anyone else. And so it has become, and initially we did handle all the office handled all felony narcotics cases for the Manhattan DA. That changed during the crack epidemic, but still we handle more of the Manhattan cases than from any other borough. But now we coordinate high-level prosecutions over the drug organizations that are supplying drugs that are coming into the city. So we target the fentanyl importers who are importing the fentanyl from Mexico and then pressing it into pills, or are organizing little packaging mills where they are putting the fentanyl into bags and then sending it literally all over the country. In addition to that, we try to develop strategies that will be effective in addressing the supply down lower on the streets and addressing those areas where we see concentration of overdose deaths in using whatever tools are at our disposal and working with the New York City Police Department, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and anybody else who's working in this area.
I think it's just to stick on the peculiarity of the SNP's office. It's unintuitive to many listeners, unintuitive to me when I first figured it out, that essential criminal justice function of prosecution is distributed across the 5 boroughs, that unlike any other city, Manhattan has 5 DAs. Why do you think that there is a good reason for drug prosecution being treated differently, that's something that requires sort of a centralized office, centralized focus?
Yeah, and it's true now. And it's always been true. There's a flow to narcotics. Narcotics really is based on criminal organizations that are outside of New York City. It's always been true. The heroin came in originally from Asia, and traditional organized crime was responsible for distributing it maybe to Harlem criminal organizations, and maybe the traditional organized crime was centered in Brooklyn. And now fentanyl is coming in from Mexico. And most of the large loads we see coming in are coming across the borders and then across the country, and much of it is coming in through the Bronx. Why the Bronx? Because there's good cover for it. It's coming in loads of vegetables or other products that are often imported from Mexico. And the Bronx has a lot of highways running through it. And they also have Hunt's Market, which provides a good reason for a large truck to be coming. Or the trucks might be offloaded in New Jersey and then come into the Bronx where these packaging mills are. And of course, that recent tragedy involving the child at a daycare center in the Bronx who was exposed to fentanyl and then died. My guess is that daycare center was being used as a front for a packaging mill. The fentanyl, it's my understanding, was stored under floorboards there, and perhaps there was some residue in the area. But that's something that we've seen time and time again, that is these small locations or apartments, houses in nondescript areas being used to package fentanyl. And then it flows. It flows to Manhattan. It flows to Queens. It flows throughout the Bronx into Brooklyn, and it flows throughout the rest of the country. And there's an organization behind it, and traditionally you work up the chain and try to find the source and cut it off at the highest place you can. And that's the nature of narcotics. That's the nature of narcotics trafficking. And so it makes sense for a city like New York, which is the center of so many things, but it's New York City that is the center. And it makes sense for New York to have this kind of a concentration of resources, citywide resources, on this problem.
I want to talk about you for just a minute. You've been the Special Narcotics Prosecutor since 1998. I believe you've held the job longer than anyone else. How did you get the role? Tell us about taking it on and what you did before to prepare for it.
Well, I was in the Manhattan DA's office before I came to Special Narcotics, and I started there in 1983. And I was a homicide and sex crimes prosecutor during the crack epidemic. And it was just a very, very traumatic time to be prosecuting cases. We talk about, the fentanyl crisis now and how many lives fentanyl is claiming. Crack claimed lives too, but not by overdose. The crack organizations were very, very violent, and the number of homicides reached the record in 1990 with about 2,600 homicides at that time. So the balance was different, but it was the crack organizations, the way crack was being distributed, imported, et cetera, that caused this kind of violence. And I saw it day after day after day as a line assistant handling homicides and actually sex crimes. And I really wanted to get on the front end of the issue and deal with the large loads that were coming in, try to staunch the problem before it hit the streets and caused so much tragedy that I was dealing with on a daily basis.
And then, by the time you're in the Special Narcotics Prosecutor's office, the crack crisis has, if not fully ended, then retreated.
Now it has. But when I went over in, I think it was around 1990, 91, 90 was the year we peaked in terms of homicide deaths in the city. And I went over in about 91, and I was head of the unit that handled the major wiretap investigations. And we did a lot of those cartel cases. In fact, in one of our biggest cases, we recovered more than a ton of cocaine on a train that was coming in from Mexico, and it ended up being part of the El Chapo trial. So we did big cases at that time, and I learned how to do those kinds of cases, and eventually was named head of the office, which involved not just those kinds of cases, but some of the street-level cases as well. We have two different divisions. So we try to address the problem both from the lower-level supply side and at the higher levels.
But by the late 90s, when you become the Special Narcotics Prosecutor, the problem is at least a little bit retreated.
Yes.
What I'm getting at is what then were the problems you're dealing with, and really since then, over the ensuing several decades, how has the drug challenges facing New York changed? How have they changed?
So first, it was cocaine, crack for a while, even after the peak. And then it was the prescription pill crisis. That was the first kind of nuance, the new thing that I saw. And I'll never forget, I was sitting in on a weekend just going through search warrant results, and we saw prescription pills being sold on a corner that actually usually sold crack. And I was really wondering about what that was, because we never saw that mix. And I started looking further and seeing that we were recovering more of it. I got records from the state's Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, which tracks all the prescriptions that are prescribed in the city. And I saw that there was a huge spike up in oxycodone prescriptions. And as I got more and more into it, I came to learn, and my office came to learn, that there were doctors running pill mills. We identified one doctor whom we prosecuted, a Dr. Lee, who we tracked many deaths, overdose deaths, and ultimately prosecuted him in connection with 3 of those deaths. And so that was the next phase that we saw. Right after that, heroin came right in back of it. And the heroin was coming across the southwest border from Mexico. The Mexicans cartels were controlling that. And then we got hit with fentanyl after that. So it's never been static. It's been one thing after another, and prosecuting prescription drugs and that whole issue was far different from prosecuting heroin or cocaine or now fentanyl.
What makes those things different? In what regard does the substance affect the strategy for prosecution?
Well, the easiest distinction that you can draw is with the prescription drugs. It's doctors who have licenses who are prescribing them. And so that kind of activity is already regulated. So if you can get the regulations in place, and doctors are responsive to prosecution. I mean, they see somebody being prosecuted, they know there's a lot at stake. And so the regulatory rules were very effective there. Some of the criminal prosecutions really deterred conduct. So that's one set of things. The difference between both heroin and cocaine and fentanyl is huge. Both of those, heroin and cocaine, are organic products. Fentanyl is synthetic, and potentially an endless supply of it because it's synthetic. It's all chemicals. And those chemicals are coming from China, going into Mexico, which is right our border to the south, our biggest trading partner, and then coming across the border. So that presents very significant challenges that are actually different from the challenges we faced with heroin and cocaine.
There's one school of thought, just to stick with the prescription drugs for a second, there's one school of thought that says essentially prosecution or more generally enforcement around prescription drugs compounded, indirectly made things worse by cracking down on the supply of prescription drugs. People substituted from opioids of a known dose and potency to heroin and then to fentanyl. What do you make of that story? How do you respond to people who make that argument?
I mean, I can understand why people would think that, but it's actually not a very informed. If you understand the way drugs work and drug organizations work, it's not really responsive to the kind of problems that we see. Number one, we saw the use of heroin going up at the same time the abuse of pills was occurring, because heroin was cheaper and it got people high more quickly, which is what they were looking for. So the pills created the demand, no question about it. But the product, which is an illegal product, you can't control through regulations, and Mexican cartels were the ones that were shipping it up. And they're not going to say, oh, geez, they've already got their prescription pills up there. Let's sell our product elsewhere. We're a big market with a lot of money, and they're sending it here. And the same thing is true of fentanyl. Because we were looking to take out the heroin market, that had nothing to do with the production of fentanyl in Mexico and shipping that across the border. There are criminal organizations that are going to capitalize on people's addictions, no matter what. And some may say the same is true of the pharmaceutical industry, that turned itself into a criminal organization by recognizing that there was a big market for those addictive drugs. Mm-hmm. But one didn't, heroin was coming in already, and fentanyl would follow on its heels because it's a better product from the perspective of the drug organizations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about, we've spoken a little bit about fentanyl already, but that's really the name of the game in 2022, 2024, 2023. What is the shape of the current problem with drugs that New York City is facing, if you talk of fentanyl, but also about emerging drug threats like xylazine?
Yeah, fentanyl, I think we're going to see, hopefully, fingers crossed, that 2023 had a fewer number of overdose deaths. I'm hoping. I mean, they've gone up, and I'm hoping we'll see a little bit of a downturn coming from last year. But, the fentanyl continues to flood in. And we're trying some different strategies now, both addressing it on the major supply side, going at the cartels or the people who are importing from the cartels, but also trying some street enforcement, which is really focused in the areas where we see a lot of overdose deaths, and particularly overdose deaths in the public, which would indicate that people are buying very near to where they're using and then overdosing in public areas. So we're looking at those strategies, too, to bring down the number of deaths, and we've seen some success with that, too. We've been employing that in the Midtown South area around Times Square, in that general vicinity, where there's been some very open dealing, very open drug use. And we're looking to different areas where we think this same strategy might work. And what do I see coming up? I think, obviously, the federal government has more tools than any local prosecutor has when it comes to dealing with these issues. The problem is, it's the Chinese supply of these ingredients, the Chinese organizations and Chinese manufacturers supplying ingredients to Mexico, and then the stuff just pouring over the border. And just to clarify, I don't think it's ever been alleged that the drugs are being carried over in great quantities by the people who are crossing over the borders. They're coming in commercial vehicles or vehicles that are simply making the crossing, automobiles. That's where the big loads are coming from. And xylazine, I mean, where did that come from? Who knows? It's hard to know why the drug organizations decide to add a new product to their supply. I have heard a theory that xylazine, which is an animal tranquilizer and sedates a person, was added to fentanyl because it would create an effect that was more like heroin, which is what fentanyl is replacing. Fentanyl hits you quickly. It's absorbed by the body quickly. That's why it's used, in surgeries as an anesthesia, because it's absorbed so quickly. And what I've heard as a theory is that being a sedative, xylazine slows that down so people can enjoy their high. And so that's the only theory that I've heard that makes any sense. But what I see is it's just white powder. And dealers try to get an edge on each other, or it's cheaper for whatever reason. Fentanyl's definitely cheaper than heroin, so it'll be mixed in. We see fentanyl mixed in with cocaine. We see fentanyl and xylazine mixed in with cocaine. I think you're going to see fentanyl everywhere, because it is so addictive. And so from a dealer's perspective, it's another customer, right? A lot of them are dying, but still a lot of them are using. And the fentanyl customer will use many times a day because the fentanyl goes through the body so quickly. So it's a very good drug if you're a drug dealer, if you're a cartel. What could be better? And you know what? All those deaths, just a cost of doing business. And it's not taking away their customer base, really, which keeps growing.
So I want to dig down a little bit, and you've touched on this already, but sort of having set up the framing, really dig down into how you think about the strategy of drug prosecution, right? Because, it's not necessarily linearly more drug prosecution, fewer drug deaths. It's a more complicated challenge than that. One thing that I noticed that I think is very interesting, people may not realize, is that your office publishes data. You're doing many fewer prosecutions now than you used to, such that I think, at the peak in the 90s, it was something like 7,000 prosecutions a year. The figures you're reporting now are about 1,000 prosecutions a year. What's the source of that change? What's changed underneath your decision-making? Presumably you are as concerned about drugs, but that represents some change in thinking. What's going on there?
Well, it's change in response. The 90s, that peak in the 90s, that was all about crack. And remember that crack was really associated with violence. And that was the problem we were trying to address in those times. And the doorway to that was viewed to be through taking down the organizations that were dealing, because those were the ones that were involved in violence. And people wouldn't, they weren't going to be witnesses unless you had some kind of leverage over them. And back then, the drug laws provide you with significant leverage. And since so much of the dealing led to shootings and homicides, this gang fighting over a corner, that gang fighting over a street side, it was just people felt like they lived in target practice areas in many parts of the city. And they were deeply, deeply fearful, and they wanted action. So that's what that was all about. And, look, there's no question that far too many people were arrested and prosecuted and sent to prison at that time, and that we deal with the consequences of that. And so then there was a swing. We did eventually rein in the crack problem, and the homicide problem was really what it was. It was the kind of response to that whole situation. It wasn't necessarily a response to the drug supply. What we're seeing today is something completely different. What's killing people is the drug. And so our response to that is to target the high-level suppliers, to look to take as much supply out as we can, and also to focus our efforts on areas where we're seeing a concentration of overdose deaths and see if somehow we can try to tamp down the supply that's claiming so many lives. So it's different approaches. Just as we've gone through this, to the outside, it looks like all the same. It's all the war on drugs, right? But when you're on the inside, it's really quite different. You're fighting different enemies. The drugs are the enemy, and you're fighting them with different strategies because they're distributed differently. Their effects are different. There's some things that work in one era that don't work in the next era. And so, it's far more complex than it would look from the outside.
Yeah, one of the I want to. It seems like you've talked about two strategies, and there's some other things we'll get to. But it seems like you've talked about two strategies. One is sort of high-level interdiction, where you're focusing on taking out supply at the distributor level. You can't really do it at the producer level because they're in Mexico, but at the high-level distributor level. And the other one is sort of hotspots targeting drug markets. I want to talk about both of them. Let me talk a little bit about the distributors first. I am sympathetic to, you put my cards on the table, sympathetic to the view that says that's a very challenging way to get at the drug problem, insofar as your deal, there's a sort of a large portion of the retail price comes at retail rather than the distributor, but then B, in the current environment, fentanyl is so easy to produce and so cheap. You can now buy fentanyl pills for 50 cents that you're sort of, you're sort of trying to bail out the Titanic with a little scoop, to abuse a metaphor. I guess the question I'm getting at is, how do you think about success in that sort of high-level introduction? How do you say, this is working, this is a good use of our resources? How do you measure that? How do you assess that?
Yeah, the way I look at it isn't necessarily how much did we get, how much product did we get? And last year, I think we seized 1 million pills, probably at least 1,000 pounds of fentanyl and lots of cocaine too. Cocaine is back, by the way, if you haven't noticed. But what I look at is more disruption. That's what you're trying to do. It's disrupting the chain, which has more long-lasting consequences. And we hear it. We do a lot of wiretaps. We hear that it gets dry. And the disruption is not just taking a load, because these are organizations which are tremendously sophisticated. And they have the organization that might be based here in New York has connections somehow in Mexico. So Mexico is going to be shipping to them drugs that are worth a whole lot of money. And so they're very high level. Those connections don't get replaced easily. Then it's a cost to set up these sites where they're packaging. It's a cost. And it's, again, you need the connections. You need the knowledge. You need the connections. You need to know where you can go that's going to escape detection. You need to be able to hire a crew of people, put up counter surveillance outside, and then have the connections going downstream with Connecticut, with Massachusetts, with New York, with the dealers who are going to buy thousands, tens of thousands of glassines from you. You disrupt that, and that's a significant hit. That's going to cost for a while. It's not just how much drugs you take out, but it's like taking down the whole company. It's going to take a while to replace that. And however it takes, those are fewer lives lost during that time. So that's how we look at that piece of it. On the street side, it's the same thing. It's disrupt, disrupt, disrupt. And we've seen success, actually. We've been working in the Midtown South area, trying to disrupt. And the drug dealing was really concentrated around particular places, and it's not anymore. I hear it from the community. And the number of overdose deaths has actually gone down fairly significantly, more than in the rest of the city. And that precinct, which was once number 1 in the city in overdose deaths, now has gone down. It looks like it's going to be about number 5. So that is all success. So yes, you look at the big, again, if you look at it from the outside where it has no nuance, and why should it? Why would people whose this isn't their business look for that kind of nuance? They just see people are still dying, They don't measure success in the way I might, because of the way I look at the problem and what our goals are. We're not going to turn off the lights overnight. I mean, fentanyl is not going away today or tomorrow. It's going to be kind of like it was in the crack era, where we were trying to reclaim neighborhoods from the violence. And it would be inch by inch, row by row, block by block. We called it the model block program. And we'd take back one block, and then we'd take back the adjacent blocks. And all of a sudden, you had a whole precinct that was functioning relatively normally, and people were feeling comfortable again. And so that has to be your approach. It's not coming today or tomorrow.
One thing that you said that it was very interesting to me is, there's a fair amount of what I would think about as inertia in the among high level distributors, where you need a lot of expertise and connections to set one of those up, so they're comparatively rare. So if you can disrupt them, you can have a larger downstream effect. You can think about that as a bottleneck in the supply chain, and from the sort of broader perspective, it seems like enforcement is most effective when it's identifying those bottlenecks. So, that has shifted over time, right? It used to be the case that in the prescription drug era, you were looking for the one doctor who was the pill mill, who was prescribing 90% of the pills. How do you, as somebody who's you're trying to deal with emerging threats, how do you think about identifying those bottlenecks? It isn't necessarily, the dealer on the street versus the high-level dealer. Where do you look for having impact?
Well, how I measure success right now is in decreasing overdoses, right? So that street level, nobody else might consider that a great victory, but I do. Because I can see that, and I see two things. I see that the number of overdoses are decreasing. I hear from the community that things are actually getting better. In fact, they've said, I've had people say to me, we don't really want to tell you this because we don't want you to go away, but things are actually getting better. And so that is my measure. And I don't want to lose my eye on the street. But upstream, up at the top, New York, may not see it quite so quickly. You go to like a Connecticut or areas in Pennsylvania. When that spigot's turned off, they don't have a way of replicating that. And I feel responsible for the people who are dying there too. It's because it's coming from here. And if we can't, it's just like Mexico in a sense, if it's coming from New York, we blame Mexico for not taking responsibility. I feel responsible for cutting off the source of supply that's killing people in outlying areas. Now, in New York, there are other supplies they can turn to, and so we try to decrease in all different ways. But that's my measure. It's, at the lower levels, if I can see success, both in terms of quality of life in the community, because fentanyl, as I say, is a drug where people use many, many times a day, and it will result in retail thefts. You're going to see a spate of retail thefts that are associated with it because people have to get the money. Nobody's given those drugs to them for free. They're going to pay for it each time, and they don't have incomes or jobs, and many of them don't, and so that's going to come from stealing things, And so we see associated crime with it. So when I can see some positive outcomes there, I'll call it a success.
I want to talk about sort of some of those crime externalities of drug dealing, right? Because the harms of an illegal drug market aren't just people using drugs or the harms of using drugs. They're also, as you allude to, retail theft or associated violence. I'm very interested in those. Yeah. And the mitigation, your office is interested in mitigating those harms. To talk a little bit about the sort of retail theft phenomenon, I think this is a really big flashpoint in the public conversation about drugs and drug control. You have people who are seriously addicted to opioids, who are engaging in crimes that both victimize the community, but are themselves dealing with addiction. And so, there are two sides to the view. There's one that says the people are doing harm to law-abiding store owners. Another that says these people need treatment, not criminal justice involvement. How do you square that circle? How do you think about dealing with that population? I know you've done some work on diversion. Talk about how you think about that set of questions.
I mean, we're absolutely committed to diversion. We were one of the first offices in the country, Special Narcotics was, to offer treatment as an alternative to incarceration. And that was during the crack era, where we could see, and we had great success with those programs, but it was an alternative to incarceration at that time. So there was a great incentive, actually, for people to go into, at the time, for felony offenses, generally residential treatment was required. And there were a number of different markers they had to hit before they could graduate from the program. And those programs were quite successful. And then, a couple of things happened. I think, number one, was less and less funding for treatment programs, and especially long-term residential treatment programs. It takes a long time for someone who has a serious addiction issue to kind of reclaim their lives, and they need a lot of support, and it costs money. And so there was, I think, from the point of view of government funders, a push to reduce the amount of time. And then there was a push, too, in certain areas of criminal justice to not make it an either-or proposition, not make it an alternative to incarceration. And so a lot of those programs closed up. If you look at the number of people going into treatment, oddly, as the number of people who are overdosing has increased, the number of people who are going into treatment that is paid for by the state, so it's tracked by one of the state agencies, has decreased and decreased substantially. And so I believe in treatment 100%. We still send people through treatment. And we support, and treatment is so much more robust now. It's not just about drug treatment. There's resources devoted to helping people find employment. All kinds of other supports are available in some of our treatment programs. So they're much more robust. But still we see, sometimes it doesn't work as much when you don't have that counter incentive, where you don't have the stick. You don't have the potential incarceration hanging over somebody's head, because it is just so hard. It is very, very difficult, especially with fentanyl. It's such an addictive drug.
And then the other angle, the other sort of externality, striking at violent crime. And I think that when many listeners, particularly listeners who are around for the crack epidemic, form their opinions about drugs and drug policy, they think about, well, black markets are associated, black markets cause violence. Drug markets are intrinsically very violent. It is significant to me that contemporary drug markets are much less violent. They're still violent, but they're much less violent than they were in the height of the crack era. I wonder if you could talk about what that change looks like, what do you think has instigated that change, and then how you think about drug market violence today versus how you thought about it when you were prosecuting back in the 90s.
Yeah, the crack itself is a stimulant drug. And so the drug itself made people, its effect on people was not to, the way fentanyl affects them, make them sleepy, you go into a nod or kind of get knocked out. But with crack, it heightens their awareness, their sensitivities. And so the drug itself was associated with more violence, just as you see meth associated with more violence. But the other thing about crack is cocaine cooked up with baking soda, And so anybody at that time, any group of people could throw together their money, go up to Washington Heights, which had a relatively large supply of crack, or go to other locations throughout the city and buy, a few ounces. They didn't have to have that much money, and then cook it up. And they'd sell it in vials that were worth $3, $5, $10. In order to make their money back, they had to sell a lot. And they were using the stuff themselves, too, oftentimes. And so one organization would set up on one side of the street or on one street corner, and they were, their own organization. There'd be another one across the street on the other corner, and one would take business away from the other. They wanted to make money. They, not only make their investment back, but multiply it. And so they would get into violent shootouts, or there'd be a lot of violence associated with these organizations, and people would just get caught in the crossfire all the time. That really simplifies it. But the fact that crack was so accessible and kind of anybody could get into the business made it just kind of, in certain neighborhoods, it just got way out of control. Fentanyl, as I described, is kind of a different, it's more streamlined distribution network. You kind of have to have some connections in order to get it at the highest levels. And then even downstream, it's just the distribution works differently. And the other thing about fentanyl, the clients are coming back no matter what. The withdrawal is just a horrifying experience. If you've ever talked to somebody who's gone through it, people feel like they're going to die. So those customers are coming back. And so I don't think the dealers are so concerned about if you set up next to them, they're still going to have their business. It's the more the merrier in a sense. It's going to be your deal, your client, your customer today, mine tomorrow. So we don't see that same kind of violence associated with it as we did with crack.
I think it's very interesting. You would expect to have, let me phrase, there were a lot of competitors in the crack cocaine market, right? There were all of these street gangs that had sort of arisen in the late 70s, early 80s that all get into the crack business at the same time. And they are sort of the active competitors. What's interesting is that, fentanyl as precursors are easier to obtain in theory than any other substance, than any other prior drug causing a crisis. I personally will not, but I could theoretically go online and buy some fentanyl. I buy fentanyl precursors. It's not that hard to make. And yet, as you're alluding to, it seems like the supply chain is much more controlled, is much less sort of free-for-all, at least at the final point of sale. It seems like that's less true in Mexico, but it's still true here. Do you think that's accurate? And why is the supply chain more professionalized? Why is it more uniform? If that's an accurate characterization.
It's a little bit different with the fentanyl supply chain. The U.S. has regulated the distribution of some of the the chemicals that are used to make fentanyl, and so it's not so easy to get those into the country as it is to get it into Mexico. And so what the U.S. is trying to do now is negotiate with China to get China to control flat out the distribution of those chemicals. But they already reached a deal when we started to see fentanyl come in. We started to see it come in bulk from China. And then the U.S. negotiated with China to shut down the actual supplying of fentanyl. But the chemicals, too, the precursors, are better controlled within the U.S. And obviously, we can't do anything about what's going on in Mexico. It's not really controlled there. So the international picture, profoundly affects the distribution chain and the supply chain here.
I want to ask you a little bit about your role as the special narcotics prosecutor within the broader spectrum of criminal justice in New York. I talk to local government officials occasionally, and the thing that always surprises me in those conversations is the amount of buck passing. There's I think a real struggle in local government to coordinate, to get things done, and to identify responsibility and how to execute projects successfully across multiple agencies. You've been in this role for almost 30 years. You have a fair amount of experience attempting to, achieve mission goals, as it were, to execute. In your experience, how do you think about coordinating with other components of New York City's government? What works for you, what doesn't?
We always have to coordinate no matter what. And so starting with the 5 DAs, we work together with them to kind of set goals and make sure nobody's stepping on anybody else's toes. And we work very closely with the DEA and with the NYPD. And what works is, number one, if you know what you're talking about and you have a game plan, a lot of people don't. They rise up in different areas, or they know that they're very smart people, but they may not know this particular area. And so if you have experience, if you've had good results, and you have a strategy, that makes sense, and usually you'll get a hearing. If you have some credibility, you'll be able to work with people because you've delivered before, meaning you follow through on what you say you're going to follow through on. There are areas of government where we've had greater ability to collaborate, and other areas where we haven't had such great ability to collaborate. I think, there's a general, in many areas of government, there might be a distrust of law enforcement or a view, you don't belong here in this area, in this space, and then it's hard to work. But sometimes you can get people to come around too, if you find a way that you can assist them in an area where they're, kind of beating their head into the wall, and you find a way to help, you get some credibility. And my office really is dedicated to problem solving. We're not trying to claim anybody's credit or anything like that. We're really focused on our mission, and I think other organizations appreciate that.
I want to zero in on something you said, and we're coming towards the end. Just a couple more questions, but I want to zero in on something that you said, which is something that I hear a lot from people who work in and around law enforcement, which is sometimes you find partners, people who will respond saying this isn't really a law enforcement job, and it seems like that is A, increasingly true in the drug control space, B, increasingly true across a variety of spaces in the past 3 years. Is that your experience? Do you think that there is, increasing unwillingness, at least in some sectors, to address drugs or other problems through, with law enforcement partners? And if so, what do you say to people who make that argument?
I actually think there's more openness now than there was. I think that certainly we hit our peak in distrust of law enforcement. But to me, it feels like there's more openness to exploring some of the tools that we might have. And I think one of the reasons for that is what you described at the beginning of this podcast, the fact that our prosecutions are significantly decreased since the height of the crack epidemic. And honestly, even more importantly, the number of people we send to state prison has significantly decreased. So we're not just talking, we're walking the walk. Our results indicate that we buy into incarceration isn't the answer to everything. But law enforcement has an important role to play. And we can net results. We can reap results in areas, but the tools don't have to be harmful in the way they've been viewed as being harmful. So I find more openness now than I would have found 5 years ago, I'd say, 4 years ago. I find a little more willingness to work together, a little more willingness to listen.
And then I wanted to ask just a little bit about, there have been a number of, then I'll give context to the audience, a number of sort of legal changes affecting your office. New York State bail reform, which has made many felony drug offenses not bail eligible, and the discovery reform, which has increased the burden on the prosecution to disclose information germane to the case to the defense in a, some might say, overly timely fashion, depending on one's interpretation. Right. I'm curious about how those changes in New York State criminal justice reform have affected your office. What has the impact been for you?
Well, the bail changes, certainly have affected our work significantly. We have a lot of defendants who aren't from New York or maybe not even from the U.S., and because of the changes in the law, There are some of those defendants who are charged with very high-level offenses, may be associated with importing really, some cases, 20 pounds of drugs, 50 pounds of drugs, may not be eligible for bail. They did change some of the bail laws initially when the legislators saw that was actually happening, but they've left some loopholes, which mean that no matter, for example, how much methamphetamine you're arrested with, you're not eligible for bail unless there's some very strange circumstance. So there are still some loopholes there, but it is what it is. It's now, we've been working with it for 3 years and we're moving on, except I'm still trying to get the meth law changed because I think meth is going to hit us really hard. And that will be difficult if we have no way to hold people in. And with regard to the discovery, it's a very accelerated time schedule. And, there's it's hard to work sometimes with the legislature and say, look, here's this change. It's not a big change here, but we think this one would really make things much more reasonable. But they're fearful if they open the door to any change, then, everybody's going to come running through the door. So it's hard to get rational changes. The whole process was really demoralizing in that there was no consultation. There were no hearings on any of this. And so, of course, there are going to be some big mistakes made. And I think the methamphetamine one, for example, was a big mistake because they just don't know the laws and what's defined as a narcotic drug. And so it's demoralizing just not to be consulted whatsoever because why? Because you might have information that, I don't know. That's hard to understand. But, all of it, we're moving past it. They've given us a lot of money to try to cope with it and try to find solutions for it. And an office like mine, which is relatively small compared to some of the DA's offices, we're finding ways to do it. Now, if you get to some of the larger DA's offices, like the Bronx DA's office, they are down, I think, 150 attorneys. They've had and that's the office, that's the borough, which has had the highest rate of overdose deaths. It's got the highest rate of poverty. It's got the highest rate of shootings, homicides. They are really, they struggle with big, big problems. And so having these challenges in their cases really adds a huge burden. And a lot of assistants have left because of that. And so I don't feel that we have much to complain about. But I think it's very burdensome in for those offices who have very, very large caseloads.
And then just to sort of wrap up on a looking forward note, we've talked a lot about fentanyl, about the emerging fentanyl threat. We talked about other emerging drug threats. As we're sort of moving into 2024, you've expressed some optimism that the OD death rate is going down. But how do you see the drug game changing? What's on your horizon? What are you thinking about as the next emerging problem or the next development?
I think synthetic drugs overall are going to continue to be a big problem because they are so inexpensive to manufacture and fentanyl has proven that, methamphetamine has proven that. I think the next emerging problem for New York is going to be methamphetamine. And cocaine has come back big too. We saw that decreasing significantly. We're seeing a lot more crack now. So those stimulants are going to be big. Methamphetamine seems to be more powerful, and we're going to see methamphetamine pills. We're going to see all that same kind of stuff that we saw with fentanyl. So those are the challenges that I see facing us. But I do see more collaboration, a willingness to work together, a willingness to listen. And so in the end, that's what you need. You can tackle any problem. You have to break it down to its elements, and then you find a way around it as long as you have partners that you can work with. And that's what's the most encouraging to me.
Okay. Well, Bridget, thank you so much for
My
joining
pleasure.
us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Once again, I'm Charles Lehman, and thanks to all of you for listening to today's episode of Manhattan Insights.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did like what you heard on the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars and writing a review on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And be sure to check out future episodes of Manhattan Insights.